Hello and welcome to Book Summarist. Imagine carrying a weight you can't see but feel every moment of your life. A weight that grips your thoughts, disrupts your sleep, and keeps you trapped in invisible chains. Trauma is often that weight, living not just in our minds but imprinted deeply into our bodies and behaviors. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Kolk is a revolutionary exploration of this hidden burden and a compassionate guide to healing. What sets this book apart is its ability to connect cutting-edge neuroscience with human experience. Through vivid stories and groundbreaking research, Kolk reveals a truth we rarely talk about. Trauma doesn't simply fade away over time. It lingers in the very wiring of our brain and the patterns of our body, shaping how we experience the world. But here's the hope-filled twist. Healing is possible. In this transformative journey, Kolk introduces powerful therapies, from mindfulness and yoga to EMDR and creative expression, that go beyond traditional talk therapy. It's a book about resilience, reconnection, and reclaiming the life trauma tried to steal. Prepare for an in-depth chapter-by-chapter journey that will challenge your understanding of trauma, illuminate the pathways to healing, and empower you with insights to navigate your own or a loved one's recovery. Chapter 1. Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. The book begins in the 1970s with Bessel Kolk's work as a young psychiatrist at the Veterans Administration. There, he encountered Vietnam War veterans who had survived the battlefield but were being haunted by invisible scars. Despite being physically safe back home, they lived in constant terror, plagued by flashbacks, violent outbursts, and a deep emotional numbness. Kolk vividly recounts a heartbreaking moment when a veteran described hiding under his dining room table with a knife, convinced he was still in combat. This wasn't just a mental issue. Their bodies were trapped in survival mode, unable to distinguish between past and present threats. The medical world at that time had no language for this phenomenon. These symptoms were often dismissed as weakness or moral failure. But Kolk saw something deeper. Trauma had rewired their brains and left their nervous systems in a state of hypervigilance. It wasn't until 1980 that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was formally recognized, giving a name to what so many veterans were living through. Through these early experiences, Kolk realized that trauma isn't just about terrible memories. It lives in the body. Understanding this was the first step toward effective treatment, and this revelation would shape his entire career. Chapter 2. The Rediscovery of Trauma. This chapter takes us back to a time when the understanding of trauma was fragmented and misunderstood. Kolk skillfully recounts the journey of trauma research, starting with the work of 19th-century neurologists like Jean-Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet, who first observed the strange, unexplained symptoms in their patients after traumatic experiences. However, the rise of Freudian psychoanalysis shifted the focus from real traumatic events to suppressed fantasies, and trauma research was largely abandoned. The narrative of trauma resurfaced with World War I when shell-shocked soldiers returned from the front lines, exhibiting uncontrollable shaking, nightmares, and violent rages. Kolk underscores how society's understanding of trauma evolved with the feminist movement in the 1970s when advocates for rape survivors demanded acknowledgement of the lasting emotional scars. This was followed by groundbreaking studies on childhood abuse and domestic violence. The key takeaway from this chapter is the realization that trauma isn't just something that happens to people in extreme circumstances like war zones. Trauma can take many forms: neglect, bullying, car accidents, or the loss of a loved one. And it leaves a lasting imprint regardless of the source. Chapter 3. The Mind-Body Connection. In this chapter, Kolk masterfully explains how trauma is not just a psychological condition, but a full-body experience. He shares a striking observation from his clinical practice. Traumatized individuals often feel disconnected from their bodies. Their natural ability to interpret physical sensations, hunger, fatigue, even joy, becomes dulled or overwhelmed by sensations of fear and tension. Kolk describes how brain imaging studies have revolutionized the understanding of trauma. When trauma survivors recall distressing events, the brain's language centers often go dark while the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, lights up like a wildfire. This neural pattern shows that trauma is stored not in words, but in physical sensations and emotional responses. One of the most compelling moments in the chapter is a story of a woman who had survived a brutal car accident. Despite being physically healed, she would freeze at the sound of screeching tires, her body reacting as though the crash was happening all over again. Kolk explains that this is the body's survival system stuck on high alert. The author introduces the idea that healing trauma requires more than just talking about it. Survivors need to reconnect with their bodies and rewire their nervous systems to differentiate between real threats and harmless memories. This sets the foundation for many of the body-focused therapies he will explore later in the book. Chapter 5: The Imprint of Trauma on Relationships. This chapter explores one of the most devastating effects of trauma, its impact on relationships. Kolk shares heart-wrenching stories of patients who struggled to maintain healthy connections with family, friends, and romantic partners. One particularly moving account involves a man who had grown up in an abusive household. Despite his desire to be a loving father, he found himself erupting in anger at his own children. His trauma had imprinted patterns of fear and aggression that he couldn't control. Kolk explains that trauma often causes people to withdraw from intimacy, either out of fear of being hurt or because they don't trust themselves to act appropriately. Survivors may become hypervigilant, misinterpreting harmless interactions as threats. This creates a vicious cycle of isolation and misunderstanding. But there's hope. The author emphasizes that healing relationships requires not just individual therapy, but also safe, nurturing environments where survivors can rebuild trust. Simple acts of kindness and consistency can help rewire the brain for connection rather than fear. Chapter 6: The Power of Memory and Trauma's Lingering Grip. In this chapter, Kolk delves into the fragmented nature of traumatic memories. Unlike normal memories, which have a clear beginning, middle, and end, traumatic memories often remain vivid and chaotic. Survivors recall sensations, sounds, and emotions in isolated fragments, as if the trauma is still unfolding in real time. One of the most gripping stories Kolk shares is of a woman who had survived childhood abuse. Her memories would surface not as clear images, but as sudden sensations, the feeling of a rough hand or the scent of cologne. These visceral flashbacks would hijack her body and emotions, pulling her into a state of panic. The author explains that these fragmented memories are stored in the brain's sensory and emotional centers, rather than in the narrative processing areas. This is why trauma survivors often struggle to articulate their experiences. He emphasizes that traditional talk therapy alone may not be sufficient for healing. Survivors need therapeutic approaches that engage the body and help organize these chaotic memories. Kolk introduces the concept of memory reconsolidation, a process where traumatic memories can be revisited in a safe environment and reprocessed into coherent narratives. He highlights therapies like EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing that have shown remarkable success in helping survivors integrate their fragmented memories and reduce their emotional charge. Chapter 7: Trauma and the Developmental Years. In this poignant chapter, Kolk explores how childhood trauma leaves a particularly deep imprint. The developing brain is highly malleable, and early experiences shape the neural pathways that govern emotions, relationships, and self-perception. He shares the story of a young boy named James, who grew up in a chaotic and abusive household. Despite his intelligence and charm, James struggled in school, frequently getting into fights and lashing out at teachers. Kolk explains that James's behavior was a survival strategy. His nervous system had been wired to expect danger and react with aggression. The author emphasizes that children exposed to trauma often develop a distorted sense of self. They may internalize blame, believing that they are unlovable or inherently bad. This negative self-perception can persist into adulthood, affecting their relationships and mental health. Kolk makes a powerful case for early intervention. Providing children with stable, nurturing environments can help rewire their brains and undo some of the damage caused by trauma. He highlights the importance of supportive relationships, creative play, and body-centered activities in fostering healing and resilience. Chapter 8: The Hidden Cost of Emotional Suppression. This chapter focuses on the ways trauma survivors suppress their emotions as a means of coping. Kolk describes how many of his patients initially resisted talking about their trauma, dismissing it as irrelevant or too painful to revisit. He shares the story of a police officer who had witnessed a devastating accident. To maintain his composure on the job, he had buried his emotions so deeply that he became numb to everything: joy, sadness, even love. Over time, this emotional suppression took a toll on his mental and physical health, leading to chronic pain and a sense of emptiness. Kolk explains that suppressing emotions doesn't make them go away. It traps them in the body, where they manifest as physical ailments and emotional numbness. He argues that true healing requires acknowledging and expressing these buried emotions in a safe and supportive environment. The author introduces body-focused therapies like yoga and somatic experiencing, which help survivors reconnect with their emotions and release tension held in the body. He emphasizes that healing is not about reliving trauma, but about creating new, empowering experiences that teach the body it is safe. Chapter 9: The Healing Power of the Body. Kolk makes a compelling case in this chapter for the importance of engaging the body in the healing process. Traditional therapies that rely solely on verbal communication often fall short when it comes to trauma, which is stored in the body as much as the brain. He emphasizes that trauma survivors often disconnect from their physical sensations because those sensations are linked to pain and fear. Reconnecting with the body is essential for healing. One memorable account involves a woman named Laura, who had endured years of abuse. Despite making progress in therapy, she struggled with overwhelming panic attacks. Kolk suggested she try yoga, initially met with skepticism. However, as Laura learned to focus on her breath and become aware of her physical sensations without judgment, the panic attacks gradually subsided. The author highlights research showing that practices like yoga, tai chi, and mindfulness can help regulate the nervous system and restore a sense of safety in the body. By calming the amygdala and strengthening the prefrontal cortex, these body-centered approaches can reduce hypervigilance and emotional reactivity. Kolk's message is clear. To heal from trauma, we must learn to inhabit our bodies fully again. This means not just surviving, but rediscovering the capacity for joy, pleasure, and connection. Chapter 10: EMDR and the Transformation of Trauma. In this chapter, Kolk introduces movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, a revolutionary therapy that has transformed the way trauma is treated. He recalls his initial skepticism about EMDR when it was first developed by Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s. The idea that moving one's eyes back and forth while recalling traumatic memories could alleviate distress seemed far-fetched. However, after witnessing remarkable results in his patients, Kolk became a staunch advocate for EMDR. He describes a particularly moving case involving a firefighter named Mark, who had been haunted by a tragic accident. Despite years of traditional therapy, Mark was still plagued by flashbacks and guilt. During an EMDR session, Mark recalled the incident while following the therapist's finger movements with his eyes. To his surprise, the emotional intensity of the memory began to fade. By the end of the session, Mark reported feeling a profound sense of relief. Over time, his flashbacks diminished, and he was able to return to work with renewed confidence. Kolk explains that EMDR helps the brain reprocess traumatic memories, integrating them into the broader narrative of one's life. This allows survivors to remember their trauma without being overwhelmed by it. He emphasizes that EMDR is not a magic cure, but for many, it offers a path to profound healing. Chapter 11: Creativity as a Path to Healing. This chapter explores the transformative power of creative expression in trauma recovery. Kolk shares inspiring stories of patients who found healing through art, music, dance, and theater. He argues that creativity allows survivors to process their emotions and experiences in ways that words often cannot. One particularly powerful story involves a woman named Maria, who had survived a devastating natural disaster. Unable to talk about her experience, Maria began painting scenes of swirling chaos and destruction. Over time, her paintings evolved into images of calm landscapes and vibrant colors. Through this creative process, she found a sense of peace and closure. Kolk explains that creative expression activates different parts of the brain, allowing survivors to access and process memories that are often inaccessible through verbal therapy alone. He highlights the success of theater programs for trauma survivors, where participants can safely explore their emotions and reclaim their voices. The author's message is uplifting. Creativity is not just a form of escape, but a powerful tool for transformation. It offers survivors a way to rewrite their stories and rediscover their agency. Chapter 12: The Importance of Community in Healing. In this chapter, Kolk emphasizes the profound role that community and social connection play in trauma recovery. He shares heartwarming stories of patients who found solace not just through therapy, but through the unwavering support of friends, family, and groups where they felt seen and understood. One powerful account involves a veteran named Tom, who had isolated himself after returning from combat. Traditional therapy provided little relief from his nightmares and bouts of rage. Desperate for change, he joined a veteran support group. For the first time, Tom was surrounded by people who understood his pain without judgment. Simply sharing his experiences in this community marked the beginning of his healing journey. Kolk explains that trauma often severs our sense of connection to others. Survivors may withdraw out of shame, guilt, or fear of rejection. However, isolation only deepens the wounds of trauma. Reconnecting with others in safe, supportive environments helps rebuild trust and fosters resilience. He also highlights research showing that human touch, eye contact, and shared experiences can regulate the nervous system and create a sense of safety. Whether through group therapy, support networks, or even volunteering, finding meaningful connections is essential for healing. Chapter 13: Reclaiming Agency and Restoring Autonomy. This chapter focuses on the importance of agency in trauma recovery. Kolk explains that trauma often robs individuals of their sense of control, leaving them feeling powerless and helpless. One of the most critical aspects of healing is helping survivors regain a sense of autonomy over their bodies, emotions, and lives. He shares the story of a woman named Sarah who had been in an abusive relationship. Even after leaving her abuser, Sarah struggled with feelings of helplessness. She was constantly anxious, unable to make decisions, and plagued by self-doubt. Through therapy, Sarah gradually learned to set boundaries, make choices without fear, and trust herself again. Kolk emphasizes that trauma recovery is not about erasing the past, but about reclaiming one's power in the present. This involves learning to listen to one's body, recognize triggers, and respond in ways that foster safety and self-compassion. He introduces somatic therapies that focus on body awareness and movement, helping survivors reconnect with their physical selves and regain a sense of agency. By restoring control over their bodies and choices, survivors can break free from the grip of trauma and build a life of empowerment. Chapter 14: Trauma in Institutions and Society. Kolk broadens the scope in this chapter to explore how trauma extends beyond individuals and families, infiltrating institutions and society as a whole. He discusses the impact of trauma on marginalized communities, where systemic violence and discrimination create intergenerational cycles of pain. One striking example involves a community affected by years of gang violence and poverty. Kolk describes how the lack of safety and stability led to high rates of PTSD, substance abuse, and fractured relationships. Traditional approaches to mental health often failed because they didn't address the root causes of the trauma. The author argues for trauma-informed care in schools, healthcare systems, and criminal justice settings. He highlights successful programs that prioritize safety, empathy, and understanding rather than punishment. These initiatives have shown remarkable results in reducing violence and fostering healing. Van der Kolk's message is clear. To truly address trauma, we must create environments that prioritize compassion, respect, and safety. Only then can individuals and communities begin to heal and thrive. Chapter 15: The Journey Toward Healing and Integration. In this final chapter, Van der Kolk reflects on the transformative journey of trauma recovery. He acknowledges that healing is not a linear process but a winding path filled with challenges and breakthroughs. He shares the story of a patient named Michael, who had endured years of emotional neglect. Through a combination of therapy, mindfulness, and creative expression, Michael slowly rediscovered his sense of self. One day, he described a profound realization. "I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living." Van der Kolk emphasizes that healing is about more than just alleviating symptoms. It's about reclaiming a life of meaning, joy, and connection. Survivors can learn to trust their bodies, express their emotions, and form healthy relationships. He leaves readers with a hopeful message. Trauma may leave scars, but it does not have to define a person's life. With the right support and tools, healing is possible. Thank you for following this in-depth journey through The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. If you enjoyed this summary and want to continue exploring transformative ideas, don't miss the next book breakdown. The Richest Man in Babylon by George S. Clason. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep pushing forward.